1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to get started there in just a moment. We're going to go over our outline. We're at a shift in our outline in which we're getting ready to begin a new section in 1 Corinthians in our outline. And so we'll highlight that and get into the text itself, chapter 7, here this evening. Quick note, I do not have chapter 8 on the back table yet. Chapter 7 is a very lengthy chapter. And I don't know if we'll get through it all or not, but I will try to have 8 out, even if we finish or don't finish, try to have 8 out for you by Sunday. But again, you have about a week after that to pick it up to get to chapter 8 at the earliest, with the gospel meeting coming up. So chapter 7 is still the last one out on the table, but I'll try to get chapter 8 there, hopefully on Sunday or sometime next week during the meeting, where you pick up. The book of 1 Corinthians, the theme that we've assigned to the book, well, the theme there is in the book as we began looking at it, is about contentions among those at Corinth. And we've said just about every time, if not every time, the church at Corinth is a church just full of problems. And so we often remember the book and divide it down in our minds at least, and sometimes in the outline formed by the problems we see taking place in the book of 1 Corinthians. There are really 4 main sections in the outline that we have that we're following. And the first of those is the first 6 chapters. So we just finished that section on Sunday morning, and that's about problems Paul had learned by the report. And so 1 through 4 with the divisions, where some are saying, I'm with Paul, and I'm with Apollos, and I'm with Cephas, and others saying, I am with Christ. They were divided and were putting their stock, for the most part, in men, Paul and Apollos and Cephas. And so the first 4 chapters, Paul is dealing with those divisions. Problems that were reported to him by the household of Chloe. The problem of fornication in chapters 5 and 6. In chapter 5, the fornicator not dealt with, which leads to another subpoint here in a moment. In chapter 6, a reminder about sexual morality, which I think not only tells me the problem is more widespread, but sets us up for the question we're going to get into here at the beginning of chapter 7 in just a moment. Chapter 5 not only is dealing with the problem of fornication and the fornicator among them, but the problem of discipline, or in reality, as we've said, the lack thereof. And chapter 6 is litigation. Chapter 7, then, and I'll get to this more in a moment, when we get to chapter 7, begins with a shift, and that is about some questions they've asked. And we'll look at that in verse 1 as it transitions here in a moment. But that continues on through chapter 14, as the phrase now concerning that we'll see in a moment appears several times. In chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 12, those phrases would occur. And we've got a couple of different units of chapters. So chapter 7 is marriage, we'll get to that in a minute. 8 through 10, some questions about meat sacrificed to idols. Again, that section begins with now concerning. Spiritual gifts in 12 through 14 begins with the phrase now concerning. Really, it's 11. That doesn't seem to be dealing with have that phrase, but it's in that same section. It seems to be the problems they've been asking, the questions they've been asking Paul in 7 through 14. 15 then is about false teaching on the resurrection, and 16 is collection and salutations. Those are our final 2 main divisions in the book of 1 Corinthians. We're ready for chapter 7, questions about marriage. What were the exact questions they asked? I don't know. But we can get a pretty good idea about what they're asking based on the answer that's given. Sometimes you don't have to know the question to know the general idea about the question. And if you heard somebody on the phone outside in the foyer before we started, and they said, yes, we meet at 7, you can narrow it down to they probably asked, are you meeting? What time are you meeting? And something along those lines. And so that's why they raised that question. Yes, we're meeting at 7. Right? So you can get an idea of what the question was. You may not know the exact wording or exactly what it was, but you get the idea behind the question. And so that's the case here, it seems, in some of these. They have some questions about marriage in line-up and present distress that we're going to get to bring up here in just a second. So this chapter is dealing with the questions about marriage. Again, verse 1, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. And that's what 7 through 14 is about. But 7 is the first of those. And it seems again that perhaps there's a series of questions, or at least a broader question that he deals with some specifics, but I think probably several questions about marriage they had. The key to understanding chapter 7 is verse number 26. If you want to understand chapter 7 and how to explain it, I think that something that helps you as much as anything is verse 26. And that is, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. As some of the things Paul says, where he says, I think it's good for a man not to marry. Now wait a minute, if we back up and go back to Genesis, then God made a helper for Adam because he saw that it was not good for what?
Him to be alone.
Him to be alone. And so is that a contradicting statement? No. Chapter 7 is dealing with some questions they had and some advice they needed to understand in light of whatever this present situation was. That's why the advice is not to marry. As we move through the text, we'll see more of that. And if we get closer towards the end, we see that brought out even more in the middle section of this chapter. So verse 26 is very important if we're going to understand what this chapter is about. There's a present distress. And so we're going to come back to what verse 26 mentions several times throughout the chapter. And I think a lot of these questions were spun off of that. With everything going on, should we? And then there was a series of questions, perhaps. Now the book here, if you've got the outline in front of you, you'll notice it's a lot lengthier than a lot of the ones. And perhaps I could have condensed it down more. But there are a lot of different sections that Paul has to address and questions Paul is addressing here concerning marriage in this text. The first of those is he's dealing with celibacy and marriage. And if you've got an outline, yours just has the main points for this one. It's a lengthy outline. I'm going to have some sub-points if you like to take notes. You may want to note those down. So we're going to give some a little more specific than just a broad outline as we go through. But you have just the more simplistic one, if you will, with just the main points in the handout on the back table. So the first section is dealing with celibacy and marriage. And really, I think, getting to the first question. So let's go ahead and look at and read 1 through 7, and then we'll come back and start at the beginning and sort of discuss these questions. Verse 1 beginning says, Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation of sexual morality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement, for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am, that each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. And so let's just sort of break this down. Verse 1, if you have the New King James, is going to say, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, that's the more literal translation out of it, but the ESV and some others translate it with what the intention behind that, the point is, and that is, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. That's here in quotation marks. They seem to have a question about, he's been dealing with immorality, and we're going to get again here to the immoral relationship. And the point is about the celibacy of marriage in light of this present distress. Again, we'll come back to that phrase time and time again. So he says in verse 1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. But verse 2, because of the temptation of sexual morality, more specifically, and we should have noted this back in chapter 6 as well, sexual morality is a somewhat broad term. We need to be specific. The term used here is the term for fornication. There are some things that we may consider sexually immoral. That's not fornication. And what I mean by that is, I think we would agree the sin of pornography is a sexually immoral sin. That's not fornication. This term here means to engage in illicit sex, to commit fornication, sexual morality, fornication, or prostitution, according to lexicographer Lamanitis. So he's saying because of that relationship, and that same term used back in chapter 6, that's the issue we've been dealing with in chapter 6, because of the temptation of that we've just dealt with in chapter 6, first looking at verse 2, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. So he's saying in this text, as we go through it, we'll see it again and again, in light of everything going on, it's good for a man not to get married. But if he's tempted to that sexual relationship, then it's good for him, then he should go ahead and get married instead of committing the sin of fornication. Now, obviously that's not the only motivation one should have behind getting married is avoiding the sin of fornication. But the point is, if there's a situation where they say, you know what, perhaps we would get married, but we're not going to in light of the present distress, but they're tempted to that sin, just go ahead and get married instead of being tempted to that sin. Verse 3 then, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. What he's talking about here is the need to meet, needing to meet the needs of one's spouse. And so he uses that term there in the English Standard Version. He should give her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife should to her husband. The New King James says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. And the idea of that term due her is here as a debt to be paid. And so the point of that is, they owe that in that marriage relationship to give that right to the other party. Him to her and her to him, and they should give each other those rights. Verse 3. Verse 4, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Continuing that thought from verse 3 of the giving of those rights to the other. Then in verse 5, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, here's an important question. We're going to get to a verse later on that people used to argue this. There's only one verse in this text that talks about separating. Now, I know the word separate may occur, but we're going to define that when we get there in a moment. There's only one verse that really talks about them being separate, and that's verse 5, and that has some conditions upon it. So I bring that up to say, we're going to come to a verse later on. Some argue well, they can separate but not divorce. And we're going to explain what that means, that word separate there, when we get down a few verses later. But the only verse that really talks about separating, as in being separate, and not just using that in the sense of divorce, is verse 5. And in verse 5, here's what it says. Do not deprive. So the idea here is there's this depriving of one another. Is they're going to be separate. So that's the depriving of the right of verse 3. Those rights of verse 3 and 4. Do not deprive except, here are the conditions given, by agreement. Look at verse 5 again. Do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement. Okay? So the first of those conditions on this depriving one another is by agreement. Number 2, for a what? Limited time. And 3, it was done to devote themselves to prayer. So some may we'll try to argue using some verses later on about, well, we'll separate, we'll just sort of go and cool off and go our separate ways and maybe come back later. And they'll argue from a later verse, which again will define that word separate, which has to do with divorce later on in the text. But verse 5 is the only one that really talks about them separating. That's only for a limited time. That's only by agreement. There's not one saying, I'm going to separate, and the other saying, well, I don't. And for a time, there's this agreement that for a time they're going to deprive each other of those rights. And the reason they did so is not because they needed to cool off. They were devoting themselves to prayer. And so that's what's given in verse 5. And so that has to do with the depriving of the rights in verse 5, and it's only for a limited time. The other verses, again, we'll find one later on, is not talking about going their separate ways for a time and then coming back later. Here's what I want us to understand. If you take notes, you remember write this down. I've got it in bold letters to make sure in my notes that I remember to read these. Here's the main point of 1 through 7. Some of these sections are going to be kind of confusing wording. Here's the main point. In light of the present distress, it is good not to marry. If one cannot control himself, they should get married. And they should not deprive their mate of their rights except by agreement for a limited time. And so those are the main keys we want to take away from verses 1 through 7 about the celibacy in marriage. Now, verse 7 again, Paul points out he looks to others, whereas he is talking about the fact that he's not married. And we'll explain more why he's talking about that as we go throughout the text. Verse 8 and 9 now. He addresses the unmarried and the widows. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to marry with passion. And so as he's talking in verses 8 and 9 about to the unmarried and to the widows, so those who have a right to be married, those not bound to somebody else, here's what he says. It's good not to marry. Wait a minute. Let's back up again what we talked about earlier. Didn't God create woman because it was not good for man to be alone? Isn't that a contradiction? No, it's not a contradiction. It's good not to marry because of what? Remember our key verse?
The present time.
The present distress at this time in verse 26. And so, it's good not to marry in light of that. And again, as we get later in the chapter, more details given explaining why that is. But right now, that's the point he's answering. Their question seems to be at the beginning, well, is it good not to marry? Well, here he explains you need to get married if you can't control yourself. If you're single and you can remain single, go ahead and remain single. And if you can't control yourself, then get married. And remember, if you get married, you have rights due to the other one. Well, that leads to the next question that comes at verse 10 and 11. We're going to spend a few minutes here on 10, 11, and then 12 to 16. There's some things in here that can be twisted and misused. And so we want to start sorting out on this section here. 10 and 11 now. To the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. So let's start with this here. There's a phrase in verse 10, in parentheses, not I but the Lord. And then there's going to be a phrase later on we're going to come back to, where he comes in verse 12, I, not the Lord. He's not saying, or this question after before, what's he saying there? Is it everything by inspiration? He's not saying this is by inspiration. Here's what his point is. In verse 10, here's the principle that's given. Do not divorce. Sound familiar? Matthew chapter 19, Mark chapter 10, that principle was given by Christ. That is what Christ specifically dealt with. Those that are married, do not divorce. The next section, what about the marriage between those that are believers and those that are unbelievers? Well, while the general principle, I think, would clearly deal with that, that specific wasn't brought up in what the Lord said in Matthew 19, and so Paul says, I, not the Lord. Now, here's the specific answer to your question about what Jesus didn't specifically deal with. That question raised. That's the reason for that phrase in both of those. So verses 10 and 11, he's referring back to what Christ stated in Matthew 19 and Mark chapter 10. More particularly, probably Mark 10, that's where the exception is not recorded with Mark 10. He's not dealing with the exception right now, he's dealing with the rule. And then later on, that specifically was not dealt with by Christ. That's the use of that phrase, not I but the Lord, and then I, not the Lord. That's why the phrase is brought up. Let's go now with some of the questions about this text. Verse 10 then. To the married I give this charge, the wife should not, if you have a New King James, I believe it says depart. The English Standard Version says should not separate. I said earlier that sometime verse 5 is the only one that deals with truly separating. And it means separation in the sense that we use. There's a time where they're apart, and then maybe they'll come back together. And of course, we already saw that that was the agreement to come back together. But people today will talk about, well, we'll separate, but not divorce. Perhaps we'll come back together. And then some may try to argue from this, well, see, in the text here, some will talk about, well, he's dealing with separation, not divorce. Well, 10 and 11, this word departed or separate has to do with divorce. Let me give you some evidence of that. The word rendered separate, according to lexicographers, means divorce. Thayer says of this term, rendered separate or depart, it means of divorce in 1 Corinthians 7:11. Bauer, you've heard me quote before from BDAG. The B in there, it's several men together that are lexicographers. The B in there, that's Bauer. Bauer says the word here means of divorce. Somebody said, well, okay, that's what a lexicographer says. What about what the Bible says? Well, this word rendered separate is the same word we found rendered separate, or in the Old King James, rendered put asunder in Matthew 19 and verse 6. So in Matthew chapter 19, and verse 6, you may recall that there's the term that's used that talks about what God has joined together, let no man separate, or let no man put asunder. What's he talking about in verse 6? Do not, Matthew 19 verse 6, do not divorce. That was the question he was asking about. When he says don't let men separate or put asunder, what he's saying in that text is do not divorce. It's that exact same word that is used here in 1 Corinthians 7 and in verse 10 to say the wife should not separate. So, do not separate, should not separate. Let me give some more evidence. When applied to the husband in verse 11, a different word is used, though the same principle is under consideration. And it says the husband should not divorce his wife. She shouldn't separate from him, he shouldn't divorce. It's two different words used, but they both were carrying with it the same idea, and that was they shouldn't divorce. And then, here will be the last evidence that this has to do with divorce. If she does, she should remain unmarried. Well, if they were just living separate but weren't divorced, she would still be married. So if she's to remain unmarried, that clearly means there had to be divorce that took place in this text. We'll go to that here in a second. Let's go down now to verse 10 and 11. Here's another argument that's raised from this text. Some argue from this text that it grants permission for divorce without remarrying. So the idea that some will teach from this is you can divorce just as long as you don't remarry. That Matthew 19:9 is the only time you can divorce and remarry. And that 1 Corinthians 7:10 is teaching you can divorce, you just can't remarry. Well, let's look at what the text says. To the married I give this charge, that I but the Lord, the wife should not separate from her husband. Now, she should not separate. We already defined it. That word separate means do not divorce. Let's skip that parenthetical statement for a minute and we'll come back. And the husband should not, what? Divorce his wife. What does the text say? You should not divorce. Okay? So here's where their argument comes from. Verse 11. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And so some say, well, you see, you look there at verse 11, she should remain unmarried. No. He's not saying you can divorce as long as you remain unmarried. The command was, do not divorce. Here's what verse 11 is. In the case where somebody has gotten a divorce they shouldn't have gotten, they didn't have a right to divorce, but they did. Now they realize they shouldn't have gotten a divorce. There are only two options. Either they need to remain unmarried or be reconciled. And by the way, the two are not equal. The two are not equal alternatives. If they got a divorce that they should not have gotten, and then realize that, the first solution is to reconcile. That's not always possible. Suppose you have a man and a woman, and they divorce for any reason besides fornication. You can put in whatever reason you want. They divorce. And irreconcilable differences, as they often say. They divorce. Now she obeys the gospel, and she realizes, you know what? I shouldn't have divorced him. And she goes back and tries to reconcile with him. But he says, no, I'm not going to take you back. Well, she can't be reconciled to him because he's not willing to reconcile. So the only option left is she has to remain unmarried. This verse is not saying you can divorce as long as you don't remarry. What this verse is saying is, in the case where you already did what you shouldn't have done, there are only two options to make sure that you're still living right before God. You need to reconcile, and if you can't reconcile, you need to remain unmarried. I'm going to draw a parallel to another passage. 1 John chapter 2. Both of these cases, in 1 John 2:1 and 1 Corinthians 7:10 and 11, we have a prohibition, and then we have another statement that is not giving permission. Now, some in 1 Corinthians 7 would take it as permission, though some would look at 1 John. Those that might argue 1 Corinthians 7 is permission would argue against saying John's giving permission. Here's the two statements. 1 Corinthians 7, you shall not separate. That's the prohibition. Then there's a statement later on about if you've already done what you shouldn't have done, but if not, you shall not separate. You can go ahead and do it and just remain married. But if you've already done what you shouldn't have done, here's your alternative. This is what you need to do. This is why I parallel to 1 John 2 and verse 1. You may not or shall not sin. What it's telling us is you cannot live in sin. As a Christian, you should not be going and sinning. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father. That phrase, but if anyone does sin, is not an excuse to sin. That's saying, when you've already done what you shouldn't have done, here's what you need to do. The language of 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11 is similar to that. The point is, if you've already done what you shouldn't have done, and you got the divorce you shouldn't have got, you need to reconcile, and if you can reconcile, remain unmarried. So, let's put it back in the context here of 1 Corinthians now. So I have the question, should we marry in light of the present distress? Paul said, if you're unmarried, as long as you can control yourself, then it's better not to marry. Now here's the second question that perhaps arose or perhaps wasn't anticipated. Well, if it's good not to marry, what if we're already married? And what he said was, do not divorce. Now, if you've already made that mistake, here's what you do. The rule is, do not divorce. That leads to another question. Well, what if the marriage is between a believer and an unbeliever? What do we do then? That's the question. Perhaps the question was not just that. Perhaps the question was, is it a legitimate marriage? Those perhaps seem to be the two questions from the text. Well, here's some instructions given in 12 through 14, and then an instruction if the unbeliever was to depart. Let's read through that here and discuss it, and it'll probably be as far as we get this evening. Verse 12 beginning. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children will be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So again, let's start with the phrase there we've already alluded to. I, not the Lord. We already saw a phrase, not I, but the Lord. Now here's I, not the Lord again. What he's saying is, here's a specific case that Christ didn't deal with in Matthew 19. The principle of Matthew 19 covers this. But this specific question they seem to have was not addressed. That's why he says, to the rest I say. That is, to the rest of that question you have about what if we're married and it's a believer and an unbeliever, here's what I have to say to that specific case that wasn't specifically dealt with. That's why that's worded that way. Now, here was the question. What if you have a believer that's married and they're married to an unbeliever? Should they separate? The answer is no. Do not separate, do not divorce. If a woman has a husband who's an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. If a man has a wife who's an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Same thing he said to the previous group, do not divorce. Now, verse 14, it seems that perhaps there were some questions, not just about should they divorce, but perhaps some questions even about the legitimacy of their marriages. And here's why I bring that statement up. He says in verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is made otherwise your children would be unclean. And so it seems perhaps they have the question, is this a marriage we should even be in the first place? And he's having to tell them that, yes, you're married, and that I think their question seems to be, are the children that born in these marriages legitimate children? Or is it born in a relationship we shouldn't have been in? And his point is that's not the problem here. Now to verse 15. Now these are the verses we really want to focus on in 15 and 16. But if the unbelieving partner separates, like so the unbelieving partner separates. You've got a believer and an unbeliever, and the unbeliever decides they're not going to be married to the believer. Now, I think this is important. I think it's indicated by the response, and I'll give more evidence of this in a minute, that the unbeliever departed because of the believer's belief. That was the reason for separating, for the divorce that takes place. They decide to leave. The unbeliever left because of what the believer believed. Perhaps because of the situation that was arising because of the presence of Christ. I believe that to be the case, and some of the evidence as we go on. We'll talk about, in such cases, the brother's not enslaved, God has called you to peace, and we're going to define that word enslaved here in a moment. So I think that's the indication is they divorced, or the unbeliever separated, left because of the believer believing in God and their belief. That's important when we come down to verse 15 now. Something come to this, and it says, in such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. What does the New King James say? I think it says, is not bound. I believe they're not under bondage. Some say that. I think some say they're not bound. Some take this passage then and say, well, you see, now if the unbeliever departs, they're free to marry because they're not bound. That's not what he's saying. The argument they make is because the Bible talks about the bond. We saw that in Romans chapter 7. The bond is going to be brought up later on in this very chapter. But it's not brought up in verse 15. That word for bondage, the ESV renders it enslaved. It was a terminology referring to one being a slave. And the point is this. If that unbeliever departs because of your belief, you're not enslaved to them to where you're going to compromise your faith to try to save your marriage. If they decide they're going to leave because you believe in God and they just don't want to accept that, and they decide they're going to up and leave, you're not enslaved to them to where you need to go compromise your faith and give that up to try to save your marriage. That's the point. That's why I think verse 16 says, for how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? There's two views. Some believe, and I think there may be there's truth to both of these. Some believe verse 16 is saying, you don't know, but that by you staying with them, as long as they're willing to stay with you, perhaps by your conduct you might win them over. 1 Peter 3 talks about that. The other is that somebody say, well, I know they want to leave, and this is the second view of that verse. So I'm going to compromise now, and maybe that means in the long run I can save them. I think it's probably the first, perhaps you'll save them by your conduct. If you stay with them and they're willing to stay with you. But I think the other has some truth to it too. Where they're saying, listen, if you compromise, you're not going to sleep. And if you don't compromise, you might. Here's one more thing you might want to write down. This is important. About that word bond. Bondage or enslaved. You are not enslaved to your spouse. That's the point. They're not enslaved to them to where they are so devoted they can compromise their faith. If they leave because of your faith, you are not now or ever to compromise your faith. That's the point he's making in that section. By the way, as a quick side note, I think, again, it has to do with if they're departing over your belief, then let them go. I don't think he's saying if they depart over any other reason, going back to whatever the previous reason may be, you shouldn't try to say that. If they're departing because they're mad at you over something else, you need to try to work that out. But if they're going to try to leave because they want you to compromise your faith, then you don't compromise your faith. That's the point he's making. Our meeting begins again on Sunday, so we're willing to be a week and a half from today. We'll pick up at verse 17 and go through the rest of chapter 7. Again, it'll be a week and a half from tonight, a week from Sunday.